We're going to talk about the Treaty of Fort Laramie. It's a very important treaty, as we will eventually talk about Native Americans in the United States. And this particular treaty is kind of close to home because of where it was negotiated. But the point about the Treaty of Fort Laramie is this: as these endless streams of covered wagons and herds of cattle are moving west, as we've talked, you know, the Mormons moving west, people into Upper California, people in for the gold rush. What's happening is Native Americans, or Indians as they were better known at the time, are becoming very concerned, because what's happening is these wagons and herds and movement are going through Indian burial grounds, they're going through Indian buffalo grounds, and they're forcing Indians to, and disrupting what they realize as their way of life. Okay, their way of life consists of buffalo, burial grounds, and freedom. And when those, or any of those things, are disrupted, Native Americans at that time would become very upset. And the government was smart enough at this point to figure out that if we do not do something about this and get an agreement with these Indian tribes, we're going to have problems, which they will have later, which we'll talk about. So when we talk about the Treaty of Fort Laramie, we're concerned about the endless stream of covered wagons and great herds of cattle that continue to cross the Great Plains towards California, and Indians become very concerned. This is disrupting their way of life. They're hunting the buffalo, especially their burial grounds, and their freedom. Can you imagine somebody driving their four-wheeler over your grandfather's grave at the cemetery? You would think that would be disrespectful. It was no different when they had their specific burial grounds in the Great Plains and people were taking their wagon trains through them. Okay? Well, because they could anticipate a problem, and there were a few instances that led to this, as you can imagine, the United States government invited Indian leaders to a conference in the fall of 1851. So again, to try to alleviate problems between Indians and people moving westward, the federal government invited Indian leaders to a conference in the fall of 1851. And this conference was held at Fort Laramie, which obviously is in the present-day state of Wyoming, near Laramie, Wyoming. You know, the fort and parts of the fort are still there. You could go visit this fort if you wanted to next time you're in Laramie. Well, I don't want you to write these down. You can get them off your sheet. But Indian leaders from the following tribes met with government officials at Fort Laramie: the Sioux, the Assiniboine, the Arikara, the Crow, the Gros Ventre, the Shoshone, the Arapaho, and the Cheyenne. Those are all on your ID sheet. We're not going to ask you to list the specific tribes, so I want you to know them. So Indian leaders from each of those tribes will meet with federal government officials at Fort Laramie in the fall of 1851. Now, the man that will interpret between the federal government and these Indian tribes is a famous frontier scout, Jim Bridger. If you go to Billings, Montana, you kiddos, your families, you're always going to drive through Bridger, Montana, which is named after Jim Bridger. Very famous Western scout and interpreter. And he'll be the man that will interpret this conference, this discussions between the federal government and the leaders of those particular Indian tribes. And this went on for several days. It wasn't all negotiation. They had games and celebrations and speeches, and it was kind of a get-together. But in the end, they were trying to come out with an agreement that both sides could live with concerning westward expansion through Indian land. Well, they finally came to that agreement, which became known in history as the Treaty of Fort Laramie. Now, Sage, what do you think the American government received by virtue of this treaty? What do you think they received? Considering, you know, what the purpose of the getting together was in the first place. What did the government get out of this treaty? What was their part?
Probably like access to ground, I
Pretty, you're very close. They received a guarantee that travelers going westward would not be harassed, killed, etc. as they went west. So that's part of what they got. Okay? In other words, the Indians guaranteed the safety of all settlers that were moving west. Now, not everybody agrees to everything, so what might we get in return to make sure that happens? Anybody pull this off, I'll be kind of impressed. What else did the federal government get other than the guarantee of safety of travelers going west? Because we weren't quite sure how good that guarantee was going to be. And taking the Donner Party into consideration and what happened to them, what might we have gotten permission to do along those trails from east to west? Close. We're not going to stay at Indian camps, but we might want to stay at our own type of camps, which would be called forts. Very good. The second part of that is the Indians allowed us to build forts along the trails westward. And there were two purposes for these forts. Okay, so as Sage said, the first thing we were guaranteed was safety of our settlers moving westward, free of Indian harassment and attack. The second thing the government received was permission by the Indians to build forts along these trails. And these forts would serve two purposes. First of all, to keep people like the Donner Party out of trouble, they would provide shelter for settlers that happened to come through during the winter. Okay? Or obviously they would be there in case they needed some sort of supplies coming through, or rest or whatever. But they were made so that the settlers had a place to safely stay along the route. Those forts were also militarily held, which meant the second reason they built the forts was to protect any settlers that were moving westward in case some of these Indians decided they weren't going to maybe be guaranteeing the safety so much. So they were, allowed to build those to protect. Now, probably your best example is right here in Story, Wyoming. We'll go visit that in the spring, Fort Phil Kearny. That's a fort that's over by Story, Wyoming, outside of Sheridan, that was built for this exact purpose. And it was kind of interesting, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but Fort Phil Kearny was not liked by the Cheyenne Indians and Sioux Indians. They hated it, and they fought its building and completion from day one. It's a long story, we'll get into that. So they were the Indians over there that decided maybe we weren't going to live to this so much. So you can say you agree to something, and for the most part it worked, and I'll get into that, but it did change. Now, with that said, Regan, what did the United States have to give in return? What did the Indians get for the two things they gave us, the safe passage and the permission to build forts? What do we give them? Well, we're ahead of that a little bit. This is 1851. We haven't quite gotten there yet. What did we give them? Something. $50,000 a year for 50 years. That was the agreement. We would give those Indian tribes to split among themselves $50,000 a year for 50 years. In exchange for that money, the Indians would guarantee the safety of all settlers moving west and the right of the government to build forts along the western trails. Fort Phil Kearny, one of the perfect examples. Now, this thing worked really good from 1851 to about 1865. Worked really, really good for about how many years? 14 years. But what happened that screwed this treaty up, in which the Indians no longer wanted to abide by it?
What was the years?
From about 1851 to about 1865. Everything went pretty well between Indians and settlers. But something happened in 1865 that changed the Indians' attitude towards us. What happened? What happened in 1865 of significance? Something ended in 1865. What? No? What happened in this country from 1861 to 1865? Horrific. Loss of life tremendous. Civil War. So when the Civil War ended, and we'll get into this later, when the Civil War ended, how'd things look in the South? Every cow was dead, every railroad was tore up, every farm was ruined. What'd those people have that survived? Nothing. So what did they do after the Civil War? Because they had nothing. Moved west. Very good. And all of a sudden, the Indians could live for 14 years with, hundreds of settlers going west. But what happened after the Civil War? Thousands started to go through with no regard to the Indian way of life. And we started to have tremendous conflicts that led to what we know in history as the Plains Indian Wars of 1876. And we'll talk about that when we get into the Native American section later. So the Treaty of Fort Laramie was a start of good relationships with Indians as far as westward movement. The end of the Civil War will bring that to an end, and there'll be a conflict basically from the end of the Civil War until 1876, 77, 78. Okay? All right, there we go. So let's get into this review. So, this will be kind of crazy, but we're going to bounce back and forth. Here it is right here. I'm going to give you 30 names. I want you to take out your ID sheet, and I want you to put a little X or highlight or whatever the names I read to you, and this is what they're going to use. See this? Look at, here is the test. Look at that. Look at it, look at it, look at it. And here are the answers. Okay? We're going to talk about those in a minute, but I think it might be easier if I just gave you the names first, would it not?
Yeah.
Okay, so here are the names. You get 30 on a page. I had to make them small, which means glasses. Okay? Okay, here we go. John Slidell. John Slidell. Somebody finds the subtopic, yell it out. John, Worth, Mexico. Zachary Taylor. Okay, I think you'll find these all right here. S.W. Carney. J.D. Sloat. Moses Austin would be at the very front. Moses Austin. Gonzalez. It's going to be under the fight for independence. Ben Milam. Under the fight for independence. James Bowie. Under the, I'm not sure, did I give you that one?
Yeah.
Okay, under the Alamo, okay? Goliad. Sam Houston. This one is not on there, but you should be able to remember it. Remember the Alamo. Lone Star Republic. Lorenzo de la Zavala. Okay, good. Palo Alto. Should be under the war with Mexico. Palo Alto. Monterrey, Mexico. Should be under the Mexican War. Buena Vista. Are we doing okay? Winfield Scott. The Halls of Montezuma. Maybe your last part of your notes now, or your sheet. Brigham Young. John Bidwell. John A. Sutter. James W. Marshall. Moses Rogers. Jim Bridger. Okay, back to the war with Mexico. Gadsden Purchase. That would be at the end of the Mexican War, I think. Gadsden Purchase. John C. Fremont, war with Mexico. John C. Fremont. Santa Anna. Back page, Joseph Smith. To the election of 1844. James G. Birney. And James K. Polk. Okay, all right. Miss Warner, you ready? No? Yes. Okay, here we go. Miss Warner, who is the American leader who led settlers to a victory over the Mexican army in San Antonio that resulted in revenge at the Alamo? Ben Milam. Yeah, that a girl, Ben Milam. He was the American leader who led settlers to a victory over the Mexican army in San Antonio, which resulted in revenge at the Alamo. Very good. Tatum, my dear, what was the name of the agreement in which land was purchased by the United States from Mexico for $10 million? Gadsden Purchase. Very good. Bailey, who is the man who received permission from Mexico to start an American colony in Texas in 1820? Who was the man who received permission from Mexico? Moses Austin. Very good. Carter, other than Davy Crockett and William Travis, who was the other, quote, famous man killed at the Alamo? James Bowie. Very good. Okay. Caitlin, let's hear this with some enthusiasm. What was the battle cry at San Jacinto to rally the Americans to victory over the Mexican army? Do you think they would have done it? Remember the Alamo. Remember the Alamo!
But there's no actual way to tell.
Well, no, but history says it was exciting. All right. I'm really disappointed. I thought you'd really blast that out. Miss Wagner? Who is elected vice president of the Lone Star Republic? Yep, who was elected vice president of the Lone Star Republic? Elected vice president of the Lone Star Republic. Who was that? Elected vice president of the Lone Star Republic. Maddie? Lorenzo de Zavala. Okay, I'm coming back to you, Miss Wagner. Who is the independent gold miner in California who was originally born into slavery in Missouri? Who was the independent gold miner in California who was originally born into slavery in Missouri? Moses Rogers. Very good. Moses Rogers. I'm going to go to Miss Zimmerman only because of the relationship here. What was the name of the route from Veracruz to Mexico City during the Mexican War? What's that called? Halls of Montezuma. Halls of Montezuma. The name of the route from Veracruz to Mexico City during the Mexican War was called the Halls of Montezuma. Jordy, who was the man who founded the Church of Latter-day Saints in Western New York in 1830? One more time. Man who founded the Church of Latter-day Saints in Western New York in 1830. Kate? Who is that? Joseph Smith. We'll get one more out of you before you go, right? Good luck, kiddos. Mackenzie, who was the American general who stood fast in Texas on the Rio Grande River baiting the Mexican army to cross? Because when they crossed, he was going to report that to President Polk. You guys are very, very unprepared today in comparison to the other bunch. So you just take the period here, figure out who those people are, okay? In the meantime, I'm going to give you a paragraph assignment that I gave the other class that will be due Thursday, okay? And I'll explain this to you one more time. You just are not very prepared today in comparison to the other bunch. Which makes me wonder if my instruction sucks as bad as it appears to here. Usually my fifth period class gets better info, because it's the second time I say it, and I'm just not sure I'm very well versed today. Let me explain this one here to you. Yep. This is a paragraph assignment. Now you have not had the opportunity to do one of these, dear, so I'm going to go through this just for your benefit, okay? Now, each paragraph must be handwritten in blue pen. I don't want Columbia